Margaret Williams stood at the front of her small classroom, watching the last of her students pack their books. She had taught in this one-room schoolhouse for 3 years, and every morning brought her joy. The children loved her stories, and parents often stopped by to thank her for helping their kids learn to read and write. But that Tuesday morning changed everything. Mr. Henderson from the town council walked into her classroom with a letter in his hand. His face looked serious, and Margaret felt her stomach drop. She knew the town had been struggling with money, but she never thought it would affect her job. "Miss Williams," he said, not meeting her eyes, "I'm sorry to tell you this, but we have to let you go. The town can't afford to pay a teacher anymore." Margaret felt the world spinning around her. "But sir, what about the children? They need their education." Mr. Henderson shrugged. "Parents will have to teach them at home. We just don't have the money." He handed her the letter and walked out. Just like that, her life changed forever. No notice, no time to prepare, and worst of all, no money to help her until she found another job. Margaret had always lived simply on her small teacher's salary. She rented a tiny room above the bakery and saved every penny she could. But her savings were not much, maybe enough for 2 weeks if she was very careful. She went home that night and counted her coins on the small wooden table. $12.37. That was all she had in the world. The first week wasn't too bad. She ate bread and soup, looked for work in nearby towns, and tried to stay hopeful. But no one wanted to hire a teacher. Some places said they already had teachers. Others said they couldn't afford one. By the second week, Margaret was eating only bread and water. Mrs. Baker, who owned the bakery downstairs, sometimes gave her day-old bread for free. Margaret was grateful but embarrassed. She had never asked for charity before. The third week brought her worst fears to life. Mr. Davies, her landlord, knocked on her door with an eviction notice. "I'm sorry, Miss Williams, but you haven't paid rent in 2 weeks. I need paying tenants. Please, Mr. Davies," Margaret begged. "Just give me 1 more week. I'm sure I'll find work soon." He shook his head. "I can't wait anymore. You have 3 days to leave." Margaret watched him walk away and felt tears burning her eyes. 3 days. Where could she go with no money and no job? But the worst part wasn't losing her home. The worst part was how people in town started treating her. Mrs. Collins, who used to chat with her at the market, now walked past her without a word. The children she had taught waved at her, but their parents quickly pulled them away. One day, Margaret overheard Mrs. Patterson talking to another woman at the post office. "Did you see Margaret Williams? She looks terrible. I heard she lost her job." "Well," the other woman whispered back, "she must have done something wrong. Good teachers don't just get fired for no reason." Margaret felt her cheeks burn with shame. She wanted to tell them the truth, but what was the point? People believed what they wanted to believe. As days passed, Margaret grew thinner and weaker. She had been eating only scraps for weeks. Her nice teaching dresses became loose and wrinkled. She couldn't afford soap to wash them properly, and her hair lost its shine. The people who once respected her now saw her as a failure. Shop owners watched her carefully when she came in, as if she might steal something. Former friends crossed to the other side of the street when they saw her coming. Margaret tried to find any work she could. She offered to clean houses, mend clothes, or help in shops. But word had spread that she was trouble. People whispered that if she couldn't keep a teaching job, she probably couldn't do other work either. Each rejection hurt more than the last. Margaret began to wonder if maybe the townspeople were right. Maybe she was worthless. Maybe she deserved this fate. She moved into an old shed behind the church when she couldn't pay for her room anymore. The pastor's wife, Mrs. Grant, found her there one morning. "You can't stay here," Mrs. Grant said coldly. "This is church property. People like you give our church a bad reputation." "Please," Margaret whispered. "I have nowhere else to go. That's not our problem. You should have thought about that before you got yourself into this mess." Margaret gathered her few belongings and left. She found an abandoned barn on the edge of town and made a small corner into her home. At night she could hear mice running around, but at least she had a roof over her head. Winter was coming, and Margaret knew she might not survive it. She had lost so much weight that her bones showed through her skin. Her hands shook from hunger, and she felt dizzy when she stood up too quickly. But the hardest part wasn't the hunger or the cold. It was the loneliness. Margaret had always been a social person, who loved talking with people and sharing ideas. Now she spent days without speaking to anyone. The silence was almost worse than the hunger. Sometimes she sat in her cold barn and remembered her old life. teaching children, reading books by the fire in her little room, chatting with neighbors at the market. It felt like a dream now, something that had happened to someone else. Margaret looked at her reflection in a broken piece of mirror she had found. The woman staring back at her was thin, dirty, and tired. Her eyes, once bright with hope, now looked empty and defeated. She was only 24 years old, but she felt ancient. The educated, confident teacher she had been was gone. In her place was someone the world had forgotten, someone nobody wanted or cared about. As she wrapped herself in old newspapers to stay warm that night, Margaret wondered if this was how her story would end. Alone, hungry, and forgotten in a barn on the edge of town, she closed her eyes and tried to remember what it felt like to matter to someone, to have value in the world. But those memories felt further away each day, like stars disappearing behind clouds. The first snow fell early that year, covering Margaret's barn in a thin white blanket. She woke up shivering, her breath making small clouds in the freezing air. The old newspapers she used as blankets were damp and cold against her skin. Margaret had been living in the barn for 2 weeks now, and each day was harder than the last. The little food she managed to find was getting scarcer as winter approached. Most days she ate only wild berries and whatever scraps she could find behind the bakery. Mrs. Baker had stopped giving her day-old bread after her husband complained. "We can't keep feeding every person who can't take care of themselves," he had said loudly, making sure Margaret heard him. "It's not our job to solve other people's problems." Margaret tried not to let his words hurt her, but they did. She had never asked for much, just enough to survive until she could find work. But even that seemed like too much to ask. She spent her mornings walking from house to house, looking for any kind of work. Mrs. Thompson needed her garden cleaned before winter. But when Margaret knocked on her door, the woman looked at her with disgust. "I'm sorry, but I can't have someone like you working for me," Mrs. Thompson said, looking at Margaret's dirty clothes and thin frame. "What would my neighbors think?" Margaret wanted to explain that she was still the same person who had taught children with care and skill. But her appearance told a different story. Her hair was greasy and tangled, her dress was stained and torn, and she smelled like the barn where she slept. At the post office, Margaret overheard 2 women talking about her again. "Have you seen Margaret Williams lately? She looks like a beggar," whispered Mrs. Foster. "I always thought there was something strange about her," replied Mrs. Murphy. "Why else would a young woman have no family to help her? There must be something wrong with her character. My husband says she probably has some terrible secret. Good people don't end up like that." Margaret felt her face burn with shame. She wanted to defend herself, to tell them she had no family because her parents had died when she was young. She wanted to explain that she had worked hard and lived honestly all her life, but she knew they wouldn't listen. The truth was, people needed someone to blame. It made them feel safer to believe that Margaret had done something to deserve her fate. If they admitted that bad things could happen to good people, they would have to face the fact that it could happen to them too. Even the children she had taught began to avoid her. Little Tommy Peterson saw her at the general store and started to wave, but his mother quickly pulled his hand down. "Don't talk to her, Tommy," his mother hissed. "She's not a proper lady anymore." Tommy looked confused. "But Mama, she taught me to read. She was nice to me." "That was before," his mother said firmly. "She's different now." Margaret pretended not to hear, but the words cut deep. She remembered Tommy struggling with his letters, how proud he had been when he finally read his first whole sentence. Now his mother acted like Margaret was dangerous. The pastor, Reverend Williams, was no help either. When Margaret went to the church hoping for charity or comfort, he turned her away. "The church helps those who help themselves," he said sternly. "We can't support people who refuse to take responsibility for their lives." "But Reverend," Margaret said quietly, "I've been looking for work every day. No one will hire me." "Then you're not looking hard enough," he replied. "Or perhaps this is God's way of teaching you humility. Pride goes before a fall, Miss Williams." Margaret left the church feeling more alone than ever. If even God's representative wouldn't help her, who would? Days blended into each other in a gray haze of hunger and cold. Margaret learned to time her trips to town when fewer people were around. Early morning or late evening, when she was less likely to encounter the stares and whispers. She tried to mend clothes for money, but her hands shook too much from hunger to do good work. She offered to help at the school where she used to teach. But the new teacher, a man from the next town, wouldn't even speak to her. "I don't associate with troublemakers," he said when she approached him. The town council had clearly told him something about her that wasn't true. Margaret began to understand what it meant to be invisible. People looked right through her as if she didn't exist. Shop owners pretended not to see her when she came in looking for work. Former friends suddenly became very interested in their shoes when she walked by. The worst part was starting to believe what people said about her. When everyone treats you like you're worthless, it becomes hard to remember your own value. Margaret found herself wondering if maybe she really was a failure. Maybe she really was the kind of person who deserved to live in a barn and go hungry. She stopped looking in mirrors because she didn't recognize the person staring back. The confident teacher who had loved books and learning seemed like someone from a story, not her real life. One particularly cold day, Margaret fainted while walking through town. She had eaten nothing but berries for 3 days, and her body finally gave up. She woke up lying on the muddy ground with a crowd of people around her. But instead of helping, they were complaining. "She's blocking the walkway," said one man. "Someone needs to move her," said another. "She's scaring the children." Mrs. Patterson, who had once praised Margaret's teaching, looked down at her with disgust. This is what happens when people don't take care of themselves. It's shameful. A kind stranger, a traveling merchant, helped Margaret to her feet and gave her a piece of bread. But the townspeople watched with disapproval, as if kindness to Margaret was somehow wrong. That night, alone in her barn, Margaret felt colder than she ever had before. Not just from the weather, but from the knowledge that she had become nothing to the people around her. She was a problem to be avoided, a cautionary tale to whisper about, but not a human being deserving of basic kindness. She curled up in her corner, using old feed sacks as blankets, and tried to remember what it felt like to matter to someone. But those memories were fading, like trying to hold on to a dream after waking up. Margaret closed her eyes and listened to the wind howling outside. Tomorrow would bring another day of rejection, another day of being invisible, another day of wondering if she would survive the winter. She was disappearing piece by piece, day by day. And the worst part was that no one seemed to care. December had arrived with a vengeance, bringing the worst snowstorm anyone could remember. Margaret had been living in the barn for over a month now, and each day was a battle for survival. She had grown so thin that her clothes hung on her like empty sacks, and her lips had turned blue from the constant cold. That morning, she knew she was in real trouble. She hadn't eaten anything in 2 days except for a few frozen berries she had found under the snow. Her hands shook so badly she could barely tie her worn shoes, and black spots danced in front of her eyes when she tried to stand. But she had to go to town. Mrs. Baker sometimes threw out stale bread on Wednesday mornings, and Margaret hoped to find something before the snow covered it completely. The walk that usually took 20 minutes felt like hours. Margaret stumbled through the deep snow, her thin dress providing no protection against the bitter wind. Several times she had to stop and hold on to fence posts to keep from falling. The world around her looked like a white desert. Snow covered everything, making familiar landmarks disappear. Margaret's feet were numb inside her broken shoes, and she could no longer feel her fingers. Halfway to town, she realized she had made a terrible mistake. The storm was getting worse, and she was getting weaker. She should have stayed in the barn, but now she was too far from shelter to turn back. Margaret pushed forward, focusing on each step. Left foot, right foot, left foot, right foot. But the simple rhythm became harder and harder to maintain. Her legs felt like they were made of lead, and her breath came in short, painful gasps. She was so focused on walking that she didn't notice the horse and rider until they were almost beside her. Through the swirling snow, she saw a man on a large brown horse, both of them covered in white flakes. The rider pulled his horse to a stop and looked down at her with concern. Even through her fading vision, Margaret could see that he was well-dressed in a thick coat and warm boots. His horse was beautiful and well-fed, the kind that only wealthy people owned. "Miss, are you all right?" he called out, his voice kind but worried. Margaret tried to answer, but no words came out. She looked up at him and tried to smile to show that she was fine. But her vision was growing dark around the edges. The last thing she remembered was the snow rushing up to meet her as she collapsed. When Margaret woke up, she thought she must be dreaming. She was lying in a real bed with clean, soft sheets and warm blankets piled on top of her. A fire crackled in a stone fireplace nearby, filling the room with golden light and blessed heat. For a moment, She just lay there, afraid to move in case the dream would end. When had she last felt truly warm? When had she last slept in an actual bed? It felt like a lifetime ago. "Ah, you're awake," said a gentle voice. Margaret turned her head and saw a man sitting in a chair beside the bed. He was probably in his 30s with kind brown eyes and dark hair. His clothes were simple but well-made, and his face had the healthy look of someone who spent time outdoors. "Where am I?" Margaret whispered, her voice rough from cold and hunger. "You're in my cabin," the man said, standing up. "I'm Daniel Hartwell. I found you collapsed in the snow about 2 miles from town. You were nearly frozen." Margaret tried to sit up, but Daniel gently pushed her back down. "Easy there. You need to rest. When did you last eat a proper meal?" The question made Margaret's eyes fill with tears. She couldn't remember the last time someone had asked about her welfare with genuine concern. I don't remember," she admitted. Daniel's face grew serious. "Well, we need to fix that right away." He walked to a pot hanging over the fire and ladled something into a bowl. The smell that reached Margaret made her stomach clench with hunger. "Here," he said, sitting back down and offering her the bowl. "It's just vegetable soup, but it's warm and filling." Margaret's hands shook as she took the bowl. The soup was the most delicious thing she had ever tasted. She tried to eat slowly, but her hungry body wanted to devour everything at once. Daniel watched her with a mixture of concern and curiosity. "What's your name?" he asked gently. "Margaret Williams," she said between spoonfuls. His eyebrows rose in surprise. "The teacher? I heard you taught at the school in town." Margaret felt shame wash over her. Of course he had heard about her. Everyone in the area probably knew the story of the teacher who had failed and ended up living like a beggar. "Yes," she said quietly, looking down at her soup. "Or I was. I lost my position when the town cut funding." Daniel nodded thoughtfully. "That must have been difficult." Margaret waited for the usual comments about how she must have done something wrong, or how she should have been more careful with money. But they didn't come. Instead, Daniel said, "The town council made a foolish decision. Education is one of the most important things a community can invest in." Margaret looked up at him in surprise. It had been so long since anyone had taken her side or understood her situation. "Tell me about your teaching," Daniel continued. "What did you enjoy most about it?" For the first time in months, Margaret felt a spark of her old self returning. She began to talk about her students, about the joy of watching a child learn to read, about the stories she used to tell and the lessons she planned. As she spoke, Daniel listened with genuine interest, asking thoughtful questions and nodding at her answers. He didn't look at her with pity or disgust, but with respect. He seemed to see past her ragged appearance to the person she was inside. "You have a gift," he said when she finished. "The way you talk about learning, about children, that's rare." Margaret felt tears prick her eyes. She had forgotten what it felt like to be valued for her mind and heart rather than judged for her circumstances. They talked for hours as the storm raged outside. Daniel told her about his ranch, about the cattle he raised and the land he worked. He spoke of books he had read and places he had traveled. Margaret found herself responding with stories and ideas of her own, feeling her mind wake up after months of numbness. "You must think I'm terrible," Margaret said finally, gesturing to her worn dress and tangled hair. "Living like a vagrant, taking charity." Daniel shook his head firmly. "I think you're a survivor. I think you've been dealt an unfair hand and you're doing the best you can with it. There's no shame in that." His words were like water to someone dying of thirst. Margaret had been carrying so much shame and self-doubt that she had forgotten what it felt like to be seen as a whole person rather than a failure. As evening approached, Daniel prepared a proper meal: bread, meat, vegetables, and fresh milk. Margaret ate carefully, not wanting to make herself sick after so many days of hunger, but savoring every bite. "The storm is getting worse," Daniel said, looking out the window. "You'll need to stay here tonight. Longer if necessary." Margaret felt panic rise in her chest. "I can't impose on your kindness any longer. You've already done so much." "Nonsense," Daniel said with a smile. "I have plenty of room, and honestly, I enjoy the company. It gets quiet out here alone." That night, Margaret lay in the comfortable bed and listened to the wind outside. For the first time in months, she felt safe and warm. But more than that, she felt human again. Daniel had looked at her and seen a person worth saving, worth talking to, worth treating with kindness. She didn't know what tomorrow would bring, but tonight, she remembered who she was before the world tried to convince her she was nothing. Margaret woke the next morning to the smell of bacon cooking and coffee brewing. For a moment she lay still, wondering if the previous day had been a wonderful dream, but the warm bed and clean room were real, and so was the kindness of the man who had saved her life. She looked at herself in the small mirror on the dresser and winced. Even after a night of rest and good food, she looked terrible. Her hair was a tangled mess, her skin was pale and thin, and her dress was beyond repair. How could she face Daniel looking like this? A soft knock on the door interrupted her thoughts. "Margaret, are you awake? I have some clothes you might be able to use." Daniel's voice was gentle and respectful. Margaret opened the door to find him holding a bundle of clean clothes. A simple blue dress, a warm shawl, and even fresh undergarments. "These belonged to my sister when she visited last year," he explained, not meeting her eyes to spare her embarrassment. "She's about your size. There's also soap and hot water in the washroom if you'd like to clean up." Margaret felt tears spring to her eyes. When had anyone last shown her such thoughtful kindness? "Thank you," she whispered. "You're very generous." "It's nothing," Daniel said with a smile. "Breakfast will be ready when you are." An hour later, Margaret emerged feeling more human than she had in months. The dress fit reasonably well, and being truly clean for the first time in weeks made her feel like herself again. Daniel looked up from the stove and smiled. "Much better," he said warmly. "You look like the teacher you are." They sat down to a breakfast that seemed like a feast to Margaret. Eggs, bacon, fresh bread with butter, and strong coffee. As they ate, Daniel told her more about his ranch and his life. "I inherited this place from my uncle 5 years ago," he explained. "It's a good life, but lonely sometimes. Most folks in town think I'm odd for preferring books to card games and cattle to people." Margaret laughed, the first real laugh she'd had in months. "I understand that feeling. I always preferred reading to gossiping too." "Speaking of reading," Daniel said, "I have something to show you after breakfast." When they finished eating, Daniel led her to a room that made Margaret gasp with delight. It was a library with shelves from floor to ceiling filled with books. There were classics she had loved, new novels she had only heard about, and books on every subject imaginable. "This is wonderful," Margaret breathed, running her fingers along the spines. "I haven't seen this many books since I left teaching college." "Feel free to borrow any of them," Daniel said. "Most of them haven't been read in years. My uncle collected them, but I'm afraid I'm the only one who appreciates them now." They spent the morning talking about books and ideas. Margaret felt her mind coming alive again as they discussed philosophy, literature, and science. Daniel was well-educated and thoughtful, and he seemed to genuinely value her opinions. It was during lunch that Daniel made his surprising offer. "Margaret," he said carefully, "I have a proposition for you. But I want you to know that there are no strings attached, and you can say no without any hard feelings." Margaret set down her fork, suddenly nervous. After everything that had happened to her, she had learned to be wary of offers that seemed too good to be true. "My nephew Thomas lives here with me," Daniel continued. "He's 8 years old and very bright, but he's had no formal education. His parents died in an accident 2 years ago, and I became his guardian." Margaret nodded, encouraging him to continue. "I've been trying to teach him myself, but I'm not a natural teacher. He needs someone with your skills and patience. I'd like to offer you a position as his private tutor." Margaret stared at him, hardly daring to believe what she was hearing. "You want me to teach again?" "Yes," Daniel said firmly. "The position would include a cottage on the property, a generous salary, and all meals. Thomas is a good boy, but he needs proper education if he's going to make something of himself." Margaret felt her heart racing. Teaching again? Having her own home? Being valued for her skills rather than pitied for her circumstances? It seemed too good to be true. I don't know what to say," she stammered. "Say you'll consider it," Daniel said gently. "You don't have to decide right now." But Margaret was already shaking her head. "I can't accept your charity, Daniel. You've already done so much for me. I won't be your responsibility." Daniel's expression grew serious. "This isn't charity, Margaret. This is a job offer. I need a qualified teacher for Thomas, and you're the best teacher in the area. You'd be doing me a favor by accepting." "But look at me," Margaret protested, gesturing to herself. "I'm a failure. I couldn't even keep my last teaching position. The whole town thinks I'm worthless." "The town was wrong," Daniel said firmly. "You lost your job because of budget cuts, not because you were a bad teacher. And what the town thinks doesn't matter to me. Margaret felt tears threatening again. You don't understand. People will talk. They'll say terrible things about you hiring me. They'll think what? Daniel asked. Margaret blushed. They'll think I'm your... that this isn't really about teaching. Daniel nodded thoughtfully. People always find something to gossip about. But I know my intentions and you'll know yours. What other people think is their problem, not ours. I just don't want to bring shame on you, Margaret said quietly. You've been so kind to me. Margaret, Daniel said, leaning forward. You're an educated, intelligent woman who loves teaching. That's exactly what Thomas needs. Your circumstances don't change who you are inside. Margaret looked around the warm, comfortable cabin, then out the window at the snowy landscape. In town, she was nothing but a burden and a cautionary tale. Here, Daniel saw her as someone valuable, someone needed. Where is Thomas now? She asked. He's at the main house with Mrs. Henderson, my housekeeper. Would you like to meet him? An hour later, Margaret found herself sitting across from a serious-looking boy with dark hair and intelligent green eyes. Thomas was polite but shy, answering her questions in short sentences while studying her carefully. Do you like to read, Thomas? Margaret asked. Sometimes, he said cautiously. Uncle Daniel reads to me, but the words are hard when I try to do it myself. What's your favorite story? Thomas's face lit up slightly. The one about the knight who fights the dragon to save the village. But I wish I could read it myself instead of waiting for Uncle Daniel. Margaret smiled. Would you like me to help you learn to read it yourself? You would do that? Thomas asked, his eyes wide. I would love to, Margaret said honestly. Teaching children to read is one of my favorite things in the world. After they left Thomas with Mrs. Henderson, Daniel walked Margaret back to the cabin. The afternoon sun was shining on the snow, making everything sparkle like diamonds. He likes you, Daniel said. I can tell. He seems like a wonderful boy, Margaret replied. Bright and curious. So you'll take the position? Margaret stopped walking and turned to face him. Daniel, I need you to understand something. I have nothing to offer you but my teaching skills. I have no money, no reputation, no connections. If you hire me, people will judge you for it. Let them judge, Daniel said simply. I need a teacher for Thomas, and you need a job. It's a fair exchange. Margaret looked into his kind eyes and saw only sincerity. For months she had been told she was worthless, that she had nothing to offer anyone, but here was someone who saw value in her, who needed what she could give. All right, she said finally. I accept your offer. Daniel's face broke into a wide smile. Excellent. I'll show you the cottage tomorrow, and you can start with Thomas whenever you're ready. As they walked back to the cabin, Margaret felt something she hadn't experienced in months. Hope. She was going to teach again. She was going to have a home and a purpose. She was going to matter to someone. The townspeople could gossip all they wanted. She had found someone who saw her worth when the rest of the world had written her off, and that, she realized, was worth more than all their approval combined. 3 weeks had passed since Margaret moved into the small cottage on Daniel's ranch, and each morning she woke up still amazed by the change in her life. The cottage was simple but comfortable, with a stone fireplace, a cozy bedroom, and large windows that looked out over the rolling hills of the ranch. But the best part of her new life was teaching Thomas. The boy was eager to learn, and reminded Margaret why she had fallen in love with teaching in the first place. Every day brought new discoveries as Thomas's reading improved, and his curiosity about the world grew. Miss Margaret, Thomas said one morning as they sat at the small table in her cottage, why do some words sound the same but mean different things? Those are called homophones, Margaret explained, writing examples on the slate board Daniel had bought for their lessons. Like here and here. They sound identical but have completely different meanings. Thomas studied the words carefully. That seems confusing. Why don't we just use different sounds for different meanings? Margaret smiled at his logical thinking. That's an excellent question. Language developed over many years. And sometimes things that seem confusing actually make sense when you understand the history behind them. She went on to explain how words came from different languages and changed over time. Thomas listened with the intense focus of a child who loved learning, asking thoughtful questions that showed he was really thinking about what she taught him. These daily lessons were healing something deep inside Margaret. She had forgotten how much joy there was in watching a child's mind grow and develop. Thomas was bright and curious, and teaching him reminded her that she was good at something valuable and important. Daniel often joined them for their evening reading sessions. At first, Margaret had been nervous about him observing her teaching, but she quickly realized he wasn't judging her work. Instead, he seemed genuinely interested in the lessons and impressed by her methods. "You make learning look so natural," he said one evening after Thomas had gone to bed. "The way you explain things, how you answer his questions, it's a real gift." Margaret felt warmth spread through her chest. "Thank you. I've missed this more than I can say." "It shows," Daniel said with a smile. "You come alive when you're teaching. It's beautiful to watch." The comment made Margaret blush, but it also made her realize something important. For months she had felt like she was disappearing, becoming invisible and worthless. But here, doing the work she loved, she felt like herself again. The ranch hands, initially suspicious of the new teacher, gradually began to accept and even respect Margaret. When one of them, an older man named Pete, hurt his hand in an accident, Margaret helped clean and bandage the wound. "Thank you, miss," Pete said gruffly. "You're handy to have around." "My father was a doctor," Margaret explained. "He taught me basic medical care before he died." Word spread quickly about Margaret's medical knowledge, and soon ranch hands were coming to her with minor injuries and ailments. She didn't mind helping. It felt good to be useful in ways beyond teaching. Mrs. Henderson, Daniel's housekeeper, was initially cool toward Margaret. The older woman had clearly heard the gossip from town and seemed to expect trouble. But as weeks passed and Margaret proved herself to be respectful, hard-working, and genuinely helpful, Mrs. Henderson's attitude softened. "You're not what I expected," Mrs. Henderson admitted one day as they prepared lunch together. "The stories from town made you sound like a troublemaker." "What kind of stories?" Margaret asked, though she dreaded the answer. Mrs. Henderson looked uncomfortable. "Oh, just nonsense. People saying you must have done something shameful to lose your job, that you were probably drinking or other unsuitable behavior." Margaret felt the familiar sting of shame, but it was duller now, softened by weeks of being treated with respect and kindness. "None of that is true," she said quietly. "I know that now," Mrs. Henderson said firmly. "Anyone can see you're a good woman. People in town just need someone to blame when things go wrong. Makes them feel safer, I suppose." The conversation was interrupted by Thomas running into the kitchen, excited about a bird he had seen outside. Margaret helped him identify it using one of Daniel's nature books, and she saw Mrs. Henderson watching them with approval. "That boy has learned more in 3 weeks with you than in the whole year before," Mrs. Henderson said later. "Mr. Daniel made a good choice hiring you." These words of validation meant more to Margaret than she could express. For so long she had been told she was a failure, that she had no value. But here she was proving every day that she was skilled, useful, and worthy of respect. The evenings were Margaret's favorite time. After Thomas went to bed, she and Daniel would often sit by the fire in the main house, reading or discussing the day's events. Daniel was well-educated and thoughtful, and their conversations ranged from literature to philosophy to current events. "Have you read this?" Daniel asked one evening, showing her a book of poetry. Margaret took the book and recognized the author immediately. "Oh yes, I love her work. The way she writes about nature is so vivid you can almost smell the flowers and hear the wind." "Read me your favorite," Daniel requested, settling back in his chair. Margaret found the poem she loved most and read it aloud, her voice bringing the beautiful words to life. When she finished, Daniel was quiet for a moment. "You have a lovely reading voice," he said finally. "Thomas is lucky to have you." "I'm the lucky one," Margaret replied honestly. "I thought I'd never teach again. You gave me back my purpose." "You had your purpose all along," Daniel said gently. "You just needed the right opportunity to show it." These conversations were healing Margaret in ways she hadn't expected. Daniel treated her as an intellectual equal, valuing her opinions and insights. He never made her feel like she owed him anything or that she was there on charity. Instead, he made it clear that he genuinely appreciated her work and her company. One evening, Thomas asked Margaret a question that surprised her. "Miss Margaret, were you very sad before you came here?" Margaret looked at the boy's serious face and decided to be honest. "Yes, Thomas. I was very sad. I had lost my job and had nowhere to live. I felt like nobody wanted me anymore." "That's silly," Thomas said matter-of-factly. "You're the best teacher in the world. Uncle Daniel says so, and so do I." The simple, sincere words brought tears to Margaret's eyes. This 8-year-old boy saw her value clearly without any of the prejudices and fears that had blinded the adults in town. "Thank you, Thomas," she said, giving him a hug. "That means more to me than you know." As the days grew longer and spring began to approach, Margaret felt herself growing stronger and more confident. She was eating regular, nutritious meals and had gained back some of the weight she had lost during her time of hardship. Her hair was shiny again, her skin had color, and her eyes sparkled with renewed life. But the most important change was inside her. The crushing shame and self-doubt that had weighed her down for months was lifting. She was remembering who she was, an intelligent, capable woman with valuable skills and a kind heart. One morning, as she watched Thomas successfully read an entire page without help, Margaret realized something profound. She wasn't just surviving anymore. She was thriving. She had found her way back to herself, back to her worth, back to her purpose. The woman who had nearly died of cold and hunger in that barn seemed like someone from another life. In her place was Margaret Williams, teacher and valued member of the Hartwell Ranch family. She had been cast aside by the world, but she had not been broken by it. Instead, she had found someone who saw her true value and gave her the chance to prove it. And in doing so, she had rediscovered the strength and dignity that had been inside her all along. Spring had arrived at the ranch in full bloom, painting the landscape in shades of green and gold that took Margaret's breath away. She had been living and working there for 3 months now, and each day felt like a gift she was still learning to accept. Thomas had made remarkable progress in his studies. He could now read entire books on his own and had developed a passion for stories about adventure and exploration. Watching him discover the joy of reading filled Margaret with the same satisfaction she had felt with her students in town, but somehow deeper and more personal. "Miss Margaret," Thomas said one afternoon as they finished their arithmetic lesson, "Uncle Daniel says you used to teach lots of children. Do you miss them?" Margaret considered the question carefully. "I do miss them sometimes," she said honestly. "But I'm very happy teaching you. You're a wonderful student and I feel lucky to be your teacher." Thomas beamed at the praise but then grew serious. "I'm glad Uncle Daniel found you in the snow. He's much happier now too." The comment surprised Margaret. "What do you mean?" "Well," Thomas said, settling into storytelling mode, "before you came, Uncle Daniel was always quiet at dinner. He read his books and took care of the ranch, but he seemed lonely. Now he smiles more and talks more. He likes having you here." Margaret felt a flutter in her chest at these words. She had noticed that Daniel seemed more relaxed and cheerful lately, but she hadn't dared to think it might have anything to do with her presence. That evening, as had become their custom, Margaret and Daniel sat in the main house library after Thomas went to bed. Daniel was reading a book about cattle breeding, while Margaret worked on a lesson plan for the next day. The comfortable silence between them had become one of Margaret's favorite parts of each day. "Margaret," Daniel said suddenly, looking up from his book, "may I ask you something personal?" Margaret set down her pen and nodded, though she felt a flutter of nervousness. "Have you ever thought about what you want for your future? Beyond teaching Thomas, I mean." The question caught Margaret off guard. For so long she had focused only on surviving each day that she had stopped thinking about the future at all. I haven't really considered it," she admitted. "When I was starving in that barn, I couldn't imagine having any future at all. Now having a purpose and a home feels like more than I ever dared hope for." Daniel nodded thoughtfully. "But surely you must have dreams, things you want to do or see or experience?" Margaret was quiet for a moment, thinking. "I suppose I always dreamed of having a school of my own someday. A place where children could learn not just reading and writing, but how to think and question and discover. I wanted to show them that education could open doors to anywhere they wanted to go." "That sounds wonderful," Daniel said warmly. "You would be amazing at running your own school." "It's just a dream," Margaret said with a sad smile. "I have no money to start a school, and after what happened in town, I doubt anyone would trust me with their children." "You're wrong about that," Daniel said firmly. "Anyone who spent 5 minutes watching you teach would see how gifted you are. Don't let a few small-minded people convince you that you're not capable of great things." His faith in her was both comforting and overwhelming. Margaret had grown so used to being told she was worthless that genuine belief in her abilities still felt foreign. "What about you?" she asked, changing the subject. "What are your dreams?" Daniel was quiet for a long moment, staring into the fire. "I suppose I've always wanted a family," he said finally. Not just Thomas, though I love him dearly. I mean a wife and children of my own. Someone to share this life with. Someone who understands what I value. Something in his tone made Margaret look at him more closely. There was a wistfulness in his expression that she had never seen before. You could have that easily, she said. You're a good man with a successful ranch. Any woman would be fortunate to marry you. Daniel laughed softly, but there was no humor in it. You'd be surprised. Most women in these parts want a husband who spends his evenings at the saloon or playing cards, not reading books by the fire. They think I'm strange for preferring quiet conversations to loud entertainment. Then they don't deserve you, Margaret said with more passion than she intended. Intelligence and kindness are far more valuable than knowing how to play cards. Daniel looked at her with an expression she couldn't quite read. Is that what you think? That intelligence and kindness matter most? Of course, Margaret said without hesitation. What else really matters in the end? Beauty fades, money can be lost, but the content of a person's character lasts forever. I've always believed that too. Daniel said quietly. It's one of the things I admire about you. The comment hung in the air between them, charged with meaning that Margaret wasn't sure she understood. Did he mean as a teacher? As a person? Something else entirely? Over the following weeks, Margaret found herself noticing things about Daniel that she had overlooked before. The way he was always patient and gentle with Thomas, never losing his temper even when the boy was difficult, how he treated everyone on the ranch with respect, from Mrs. Henderson to the newest ranch hand, the thoughtful way he listened when she spoke, as if her opinions truly mattered to him. She also began to notice how he looked at her sometimes, with warmth and something deeper that made her heart race. During their evening conversations, she caught him watching her face as she spoke, studying her expressions as if trying to memorize them. One evening in late spring, they were walking through Daniel's garden after dinner. The air was warm and sweet with the scent of blooming flowers, and the setting sun painted everything in golden light. This is beautiful, Margaret said, stopping to admire a patch of wild roses. Did you plant all of this yourself? Most of it, Daniel said, moving to stand beside her. I enjoy working with my hands after spending the day with account books and business matters. Margaret reached out to touch one of the roses, and Daniel's hand accidentally brushed hers as he moved to steady the branch. The contact sent a jolt of electricity through her that had nothing to do with static. Margaret, Daniel said softly, not moving his hand away from hers. I need to tell you something. She looked up at him, her heart pounding. His brown eyes were serious and warm, and she could see her own reflection in them. These past months having you here, they've been the happiest of my life, he said quietly. At first I told myself it was just because Thomas was learning so well, or because it was nice to have intelligent conversation. But that's not the whole truth. Margaret felt her breath catch in her throat. Daniel, I care about you, Margaret. More than I should, perhaps. More than just as Thomas's teacher or as a friend. I think about you when you're not here. I look forward to our evenings together more than anything else in my day. I know this complicates things and I don't want to make you uncomfortable, but I couldn't keep pretending these feelings don't exist. Margaret stared at him, her mind reeling. This kind, generous man who had saved her life and given her back her dignity, cared for her, not as charity or duty, but as a woman he could love. I don't know what to say, she whispered. You don't have to say anything right now, Daniel said gently. I just wanted you to know how I feel. There's no pressure, no expectations. Your job and your home here are secure no matter what you decide about this. That night, Margaret lay awake in her cottage, staring at the ceiling and trying to process what Daniel had told her. Part of her was thrilled. Daniel was everything she could want in a man. He was kind, intelligent, respectful, and generous. He saw her value when the rest of the world had written her off, but another part of her was terrified. Her experience with poverty and rejection had taught her how quickly good things could disappear. What if she let herself love him and then lost everything again? What if this was too good to be true? She thought about her life before the ranch. The loneliness, the hunger, the crushing despair of feeling worthless and unwanted. Daniel had rescued her from all of that. But what if her feelings for him were just gratitude mixed with fear of being alone again? As the days passed, Margaret found herself watching Daniel with new eyes. She noticed how her heart skipped when he smiled at her, how she looked forward to their conversations more than anything else in her day. She realized that somewhere along the way, Without her permission or planning, she had fallen in love with him too. The revelation was both wonderful and terrifying. After everything she had been through, did she have the courage to risk her heart again? Could she trust that this happiness was real and lasting? One evening, as they sat in the garden watching Thomas chase fireflies, Daniel turned to her with a question that would change everything. "Margaret," he said softly, "do you think you could ever care for me the way I care for you?" Margaret looked into his honest, hopeful face and realized that she had a choice to make. She could let fear control her life, or she could take a chance on love with a man who had already proven his worth in 100 different ways. "I already do," she whispered, and watched his face light up with joy that matched her own. Word traveled fast in small towns, and it didn't take long for news of Daniel Hartwell's courtship of Margaret Williams to reach every ear in the area. The reaction was exactly what Margaret had feared, a mixture of shock, gossip, and barely concealed outrage. Margaret first became aware of the talk when she accompanied Daniel to town for supplies. They had been walking together, Daniel carrying packages while Margaret held Thomas's hand, when she noticed the stares and whispers following them down the main street. Mrs. Patterson, who had once called Margaret shameful when she fainted from hunger, now hurried across the street with a bright, artificial smile. "Margaret, dear," she exclaimed as if they had been the best of friends, "how lovely to see you looking so well. I always said you were a resilient girl." Margaret stared at the woman in amazement. Mrs. Patterson had literally stepped over her when she collapsed in the street, and now she was pretending they had some sort of friendship. "Mrs. Patterson," Margaret said coolly, not bothering to return the false warmth. "You must come to tea soon," Mrs. Patterson continued, apparently oblivious to Margaret's lack of enthusiasm. "The ladies' auxiliary would love to hear about your new position." The way she said position made it clear what she really thought about Margaret's relationship with Daniel. But her eagerness to associate with Margaret now that she was under Daniel's protection was obvious and disgusting. "I'm quite busy with my teaching responsibilities," Margaret replied firmly. After Mrs. Patterson left, Daniel squeezed Margaret's arm gently. "I'm sorry about that. People can be complicated." "She wouldn't speak to me when I was starving," Margaret said quietly. "Now she wants to be my friend because I'm associated with you. It's shameful. It says more about her character than yours," Daniel replied. "You don't owe false friendship to people who showed you none when you needed it." But Mrs. Patterson was just the beginning. Over the following weeks, Margaret was amazed by the number of people who suddenly remembered their friendship with her. Women who had crossed the street to avoid her now invited her to social gatherings. Men who had refused to hire her for any work now tipped their hats respectfully when they saw her. The hypocrisy was breathtaking, but even more disturbing were the malicious whispers that followed her everywhere. At the general store, Margaret overheard Mrs. Foster talking to the shopkeeper's wife. "I always suspected there was something improper about her," Mrs. Foster was saying. "Why else would a wealthy man like Daniel Hartwell take interest in someone like that? She must have skills that have nothing to do with teaching." The implication was clear and ugly. Margaret felt her cheeks burn with humiliation and anger. These people couldn't imagine that Daniel might value her mind and character. In their narrow thinking, the only reason a man would care for a woman in her circumstances was for improper reasons. Daniel noticed her distress when she returned to where he was examining tools. "What's wrong?" Margaret shook her head, not wanting to repeat the hurtful words. But Daniel's expression grew stern as he looked around the store and noticed the pointed stares and whispered conversations. "Let's go," he said firmly, taking her arm. Outside, Margaret finally told him what she had overheard. Daniel's jaw tightened with anger. "I'm sorry you had to hear that," he said. "People can be cruel when they don't understand something." "Maybe they're right," Margaret said miserably. "Maybe I am taking advantage of your kindness. Maybe—" "Stop," Daniel said firmly, turning to face her. "Don't let their small minds make you doubt what we have. I know why I care for you, and it has nothing to do with what they're suggesting." "But Daniel, this affects your reputation too. People are saying terrible things about both of us." "Let them talk," Daniel said with quiet determination. "I'd rather be gossiped about for loving a good woman than praised for being lonely and miserable." His words warmed Margaret's heart, but she still worried about the social cost of their relationship. Daniel was a respected member of the community, and she hated the thought that her presence in his life might damage his standing. The gossip reached its peak when Reverend Williams invited Daniel to a private meeting at the church. Margaret wasn't supposed to know about it, but Mrs. Henderson overheard and told her. "The Reverend wants to counsel Mr. Daniel about his choices," Mrs. Henderson reported with obvious disapproval. "As if it's any of his business who Mr. Daniel courts." That evening, Daniel returned from the meeting looking tired but resolved. He found Margaret in the garden where she was nervously tending to the roses. "How did it go?" she asked, though she dreaded the answer. Daniel sat beside her on the garden bench and took her hand. "The Reverend expressed concern about my association with you. He suggested that I was being taken in by a woman of questionable character who was using feminine wiles to secure her position." Margaret winced at the harsh words. "What did you tell him?" "I told him that Margaret Williams is the most honest, intelligent, and kind woman I've ever known. I told him that if his Christian charity doesn't extend to helping people who have fallen on hard times, perhaps he should reconsider his calling." Margaret stared at him in amazement. "You said that to the Reverend?" "I said quite a bit more, actually," Daniel replied with a slight smile. "I may have also mentioned that his wife turned you away from church property when you had nowhere else to go, and that his version of Christianity seems more concerned with judgment than mercy. Daniel, you could get in serious trouble with the church community." "Good," Daniel said firmly. "If standing up for the woman I love gets me in trouble with hypocrites, then I'm proud to be in trouble." The conviction in his voice made Margaret's heart swell with love and gratitude. Here was a man who was willing to face social consequences to defend her honor. He wasn't ashamed of caring for her or worried about what others thought. A few days later, Margaret faced her biggest test when she encountered Mrs. Grant, the pastor's wife, at the post office. The woman who had once called Margaret a disgrace now approached with a sickeningly sweet smile. "Margaret, dear," Mrs. Grant said loudly, clearly wanting everyone in the post office to hear, "I hope you'll consider joining Our Ladies Auxiliary again. We're planning a charity drive for the less fortunate." The irony was almost too much to bear. This woman had personally thrown Margaret off church property when she was homeless and starving, and now she wanted Margaret to help with charity work. Margaret looked Mrs. Grant directly in the eyes and spoke in a clear, calm voice. "I remember when I was one of the less fortunate, Mrs. Grant. You told me that people like me gave the church a bad reputation. I wonder what changed your mind about helping those in need." Mrs. Grant's face turned red as several people in the post office turned to stare. She had clearly not expected Margaret to mention their previous encounter. Well, that was different," Mrs. Grant stammered. "How was it different?" Margaret asked politely. "I was hungry, homeless, and desperate. Isn't that exactly the kind of person your charity drive is meant to help?" Mrs. Grant opened and closed her mouth like a fish, unable to find words to explain her hypocrisy without admitting her past cruelty. "I think your charity efforts are admirable," Margaret continued with dignity. "But I prefer to help people before they reach the point of desperation, not after it becomes socially advantageous to do so." With that, Margaret collected her mail and walked out, leaving Mrs. Grant speechless and the other customers buzzing with conversation. When Daniel heard about the encounter from Mrs. Henderson, who had heard it from the postmaster's wife, he was both proud and worried. "You handled that perfectly," he said with admiration, "but I hope it doesn't cause more problems for you." "I'm tired of being ashamed of my past," Margaret said with quiet strength. "What happened to me could happen to anyone. If me speaking honestly about it makes people uncomfortable, perhaps they should examine their own consciences." Daniel looked at her with such love and pride that Margaret felt her heart could burst. "You're remarkable," he said softly. "Do you know that?" As summer progressed, the gossip gradually died down, replaced by new scandals and concerns. Some people continued to treat Margaret with suspicion, but others began to see her for who she really was, an intelligent, principled woman who had survived difficult circumstances with her dignity intact. Most importantly, Margaret stopped caring what the townspeople thought. She had Daniel's love and respect, Thomas's affection, and meaningful work that fulfilled her. The opinions of people who had shown her no kindness when she needed it most no longer had the power to hurt her. One evening, as they sat together watching the sunset from the porch of the main house, Daniel took Margaret's hand and looked into her eyes. "Margaret," he said seriously, "I have something important to ask you." Margaret's heart began to race. She had been hoping for this moment while simultaneously fearing it. Despite everything they had been through together, part of her still couldn't quite believe that this wonderful man truly wanted to spend his life with her. "I love you," Daniel continued, his voice warm and certain. "I love your intelligence, your strength, your kindness, and your courage. I love the way you care for Thomas and the way you light up when you talk about teaching. I love everything about who you are." The wedding of Margaret Williams and Daniel Hartwell took place on a beautiful September morning, 6 months after their engagement. Margaret had insisted on a simple ceremony, but Daniel wanted to celebrate their love properly. They compromised on a lovely outdoor wedding in the garden behind the main house, with flowers blooming everywhere and the mountains providing a stunning backdrop. Margaret wore a dress of ivory silk that Daniel had ordered specially from Denver. It was the most beautiful garment she had ever owned, and when she looked at herself in the mirror, she hardly recognized the confident, radiant woman staring back at her. Her hair was styled elegantly, her skin glowed with health and happiness, and her eyes sparkled with joy. But the most beautiful thing about her was the complete absence of shame or uncertainty. The woman who had once believed herself worthless now stood tall, knowing she was loved completely and unconditionally. Thomas served as ring-bearer, practically bouncing with excitement at the thought of Margaret officially becoming his aunt. Mrs. Henderson had decorated the garden with ribbons and flowers, and even some of the ranch hands had put on their Sunday best for the occasion. The guest list was small and carefully chosen. Daniel had invited only people who had shown genuine kindness to Margaret, plus a few business associates who respected both of them. Notably absent were most of the townspeople, who had shunned Margaret in her time of need, but later tried to curry favor when she became engaged to Daniel. Mrs. Patterson had actually had the nerve to ask Mrs. Henderson why she hadn't received an invitation to the social event of the year. Mrs. Henderson had replied with characteristic bluntness that the wedding was for friends of the bride and groom, not for people who had treated the bride poorly in the past. As Margaret walked down the makeshift aisle between the garden rows, she saw Daniel waiting for her at the flower-covered archway. His face was radiant with love and pride, and she knew without a doubt that she was marrying her best friend, her protector, and the love of her life. The ceremony was performed by a minister from the next county, since Reverend Williams had made it clear he disapproved of the match. This minister, Reverend Cooper, was a kind man who had taken the time to get to know both Margaret and Daniel before the wedding. His words about love, commitment, and partnership felt genuine and meaningful. "Daniel," Reverend Cooper said during the vows, "do you take Margaret to be your wife, to love and cherish her, to support her dreams and stand by her through all of life's challenges?" "I do," Daniel said firmly, his eyes never leaving Margaret's face. "I promise to love and respect Margaret for who she is, to support her goals and dreams, and to remind her every day of her worth and value." When it was Margaret's turn, she spoke with a clear, strong voice. "Daniel, I promise to love you not just for saving my life, but for helping me remember who I am. I promise to be your partner in all things, to support your dreams as you've supported mine, and to build a life with you based on love, respect, and shared values." There wasn't a dry eye in the small gathering as they exchanged rings and sealed their vows with a kiss that spoke of deep love and unshakable commitment. At the reception that followed, Margaret found herself surrounded by people who genuinely cared about her happiness. Pete, the gruff ranch hand who had been skeptical of her at first, raised a toast. "To Mrs. Margaret Hartwell," he said with unusual eloquence. "She came to us when she had nothing, but she brought everything this ranch needed. A good teacher, a kind heart, and the sense to see what a fine man our boss is." Everyone laughed and cheered, and Margaret felt tears of joy streaming down her face. These people valued her not for her connection to Daniel, but for herself. The biggest surprise of the day came when a carriage arrived unexpectedly during the reception. Out stepped a well-dressed woman in her 50s who Margaret didn't recognize. Daniel's face lit up with delight. "Aunt Catherine," he exclaimed, rushing to embrace the woman. "I didn't think you could make it." "I wouldn't miss your wedding for anything," Aunt Catherine replied, then turned to study Margaret with sharp but kind eyes. "So this is the remarkable woman who captured my nephew's heart." Margaret felt nervous under the scrutiny of this elegant lady, but Aunt Catherine's next words put her at ease. "Daniel wrote to me about you months ago," she said warmly. He told me about your strength, your intelligence, and your dedication to Thomas's education. He also told me about the challenges you've faced and how gracefully you've overcome them. I've been eager to meet a woman of such character." As the afternoon progressed, Margaret learned that Aunt Catherine was Daniel's only living relative besides Thomas. She was a wealthy widow who lived in San Francisco and had strong opinions about education and women's rights. "Margaret," she said during a quiet moment, "Daniel tells me you dream of having your own school someday." "It's just a dream," Margaret replied modestly. "I'm very happy teaching Thomas." "Dreams are meant to be pursued, my dear," Aunt Catherine said with a smile. "I happen to know something about starting schools. I helped fund 3 schools for girls in California. Perhaps we should talk about your ideas sometime." Margaret stared at her in amazement. Could it be possible that her dream of having her own school might actually come true? As evening approached and the guests began to leave, Margaret and Daniel found themselves alone on the porch with Thomas, who had fallen asleep in Margaret's lap. "Happy?" Daniel asked, putting his arm around his new wife. "Beyond words," Margaret replied honestly. "A year ago I was sleeping in a barn and wondering if I would survive the winter. Today I married the most wonderful man in the world and gained a family I love dearly." "You didn't gain a family," Daniel corrected gently. "You completed one. Thomas and I were just waiting for you to come home to us." Margaret looked down at the sleeping boy in her arms, then at her husband beside her. Home. Yes. That's exactly what this was. Not just a place to live, but a place where she was loved, valued, and cherished for exactly who she was. Over the following months, Margaret settled into married life with joy and contentment. She continued teaching Thomas, who was now reading at a level far beyond his age. She also began tutoring several other children from neighboring ranches. Word having spread about her excellent teaching methods, Daniel supported her work completely, even building her a proper schoolroom in one of the ranch buildings. He often said that watching her teach was one of his greatest pleasures, seeing her come alive with passion and purpose. The town's attitude toward Margaret had gradually shifted from suspicion to grudging respect to genuine acceptance. Her gracious handling of past slights and her obvious devotion to her family had won over many former critics. More importantly, her work with the local children had proven her value to the community. When the one-room schoolhouse in town needed a new teacher, the school board actually approached Margaret about taking the position. She politely declined, explaining that she was happy with her current teaching arrangement, but the offer itself was a vindication she had never expected. Margaret's relationship with Aunt Catherine blossomed into a warm friendship. The older woman visited regularly and was true to her word about supporting Margaret's educational dreams. By the second year of Margaret's marriage, they were making concrete plans for a small private school that would serve children from several surrounding communities. "You have a gift that shouldn't be limited to just a few students," Aunt Catherine insisted. "There are children throughout this region who could benefit from your teaching methods." The school they planned would be different from traditional institutions. It would welcome children regardless of their family's financial situation, and it would focus on developing critical thinking skills alongside basic academics. Margaret would be the head teacher, with Daniel managing the business aspects and Aunt Catherine providing financial backing. But perhaps the greatest joy in Margaret's new life came 2 years after her wedding, when she gave birth to a daughter they named Hope. As Margaret held her baby girl for the first time, she marveled at how completely her life had changed. "She's perfect," Daniel whispered, gently touching the baby's tiny hand, "just like her mother." Thomas, now 10 and an excellent reader, was thrilled to have a baby sister. "I'm going to teach her everything I know," he announced seriously. "And when she's bigger, Aunt Margaret can teach her even more." Margaret smiled at his words. Thomas never called her mother, but he didn't need to. The love between them was clear and strong, and she was proud to be raising this bright, kind boy alongside Daniel. As she sat in the rocking chair Daniel had made for her, nursing her daughter while Thomas read aloud from his favorite book, Margaret reflected on the incredible journey that had brought her to this moment. She had lost everything: her job, her home, her sense of worth, and had nearly lost her life. But in losing everything, she had found what truly mattered. She had discovered her own inner strength, her capacity to survive and rebuild. She had learned the difference between people who offered genuine kindness and those who only showed interest when it benefited them. Most importantly, she had found a love that was based on mutual respect and shared values rather than convenience or desperation. The starving schoolteacher who had been cast aside by society was gone forever.